Hey guys, David Christian from the Modern Martial Artist here. Today we are covering Cormier versus Miocic in what was a spectacular, if albeit short, fight. And we're going to go really in depth about the techniques. Before we get to that, I have a couple announcements. First, new book is out. I'm getting a lot of great reviews on it from all you guys. Footwork Wins Fights. You could check it out on modernmartialartist.com. There'll be a section in the menu that literally says Footwork Wins Fights. Or if you're watching this on YouTube, I left a link below. Paperback book will be out in about a month or so. Next, Leonard versus Duran is going to be the next fight we put out, and a new MMA video is going to come out soon for the first time in a long time. So excited for all of that. So let's get right into it. I actually predicted that DC was going to win the day the fight was announced on my podcast. And the reason that I predicted he would win turned out to be the reason he won, almost down to the exact technique. And that reason being is the way that he blends grappling with striking. And I know everyone's going to immediately say, well, wait, because Miocic blends grappling and striking together beautifully. And he absolutely does, but he does it in what I'd kind of call like a clean way. His strikes are separate strikes, and his takedowns are separate takedowns, and his clinches, he'll punch while he clinches like everyone does, but he doesn't integrate it into the strike. And if you watched my last video on Lomachenko, maybe you know what I'm talking about, the way that he changes a jab into some kind of guard control midway through. And maybe the best way to look at this so you understand what I'm talking about is going way back in time and looking at early UFC and going through the different phases of how everything kind of came to be just very quickly here. I'm not going to take an hour on it. But basically, when, not just UFC, but when mixed martial arts in its current form first started, it was just styles versus styles. Like, this guy knew karate, this guy knew wrestling, this guy knew boxing. And obviously, the style that people were not prepared for was jiu-jitsu, Brazilian jiu-jitsu specifically. Everyone was like, what the hell is this? No one had any idea how to counter it. So that was stage one. Stage two was where people were still specializing because no one had really grown up in an MMA gym. I mean, some people had some styles that were more inclusive, and I'm sure certain places taught everything, but usually not together in the same class, and there was a lot of confusion about how to integrate that kind of stuff. So the second phase was people figuring out how to defend different elements of fighting so that they could specialize on their own. So Chuck Liddell is a good example of that. Became pretty decent grappler, but never used it, but was amazing at it defensively. He, sprawl and brawl, you got that, and then you got lay and pray. You got those two elements. You got the grapplers who could neutralize striking. You got the strikers who could neutralize the grapplers. The next stage was that people became good at everything. You kind of needed to be good at everything. So you could use both grappling and striking. You could use both grappling and striking offensively and defensively, and you could mix them up. And this is Miocic, like to a T. He has amazing footwork, incredible footwork, like boxing-esque footwork, and he mixes it with his boxing. He's got great head movement, and he'll blend his head movement into strikes and into takedowns. So that's, I guess, phase three. The phase after that, you're thinking, phase three, also GSP, amazing example of phase three. If you watched my video on him before it was taken down, blending his jabs and level changes and roundhouse kicks, and making them all look very similar in their setup and their preparatory motions, and then using that to supplement his grappling. So phase four is more like Mighty Mouse or DC, and that's where your strike becomes a grappling manipulation, and your grappling can turn into strikes. And John Jones, very similar in regards to this too, which is why whenever he fights DC, it's such a fascinating fight, because you see them doing a lot of the same shit to each other at the exact same time. And don't get me wrong here, there are certain fighters even early on that were able to combine these elements together. Dirty boxing or what have you, Randy Couture, just not to the same level and not as integrated as we're seeing nowadays. And the point of this is that I feel this is just, sifted down into the very base reason why DC was able to beat Cormier. Why Cormier was able to beat Miocic, and why I thought he would, is because DC's able to do this. DC's kind of go-to move, whether he's jabbing himself or he's blocking some kind of strike, is to use a mix of a leverage guard and a cross guard. So his lead arm will be straight coming out. Either he'll be jabbing forward with it and then leave it out there to catch the return counter, or he'll just leverage guard, which means just straightening your arm to kind of knock your opponent's punch off with the parry of your stiff arm, forearm, and elbow. So that's his lead hand doing that. At the same time, his rear arm is kind of Rocky Marciano-ish. It's like a cross guard, but you're coming in sideways and dipping underneath. So imagine you're leaning not forward, you're leaning to the inside. You're still kind of sideways. Rather than Tyson. Think of Tyson or Archie Moore, right? They lean forward in that cross arm guard. Rocky Marciano more sideways, coming in with his jab with those tiny arms of his, and his rear hands just kind of, like a bent arm dab, and he's tucking that chin. And that's an incredibly effective technique. It looks sloppy, and you get clipped with a lot of punches, but they don't have a lot of impact. People thought Rocky Marciano was taking a lot more damage than he was, and it looks like DC's taking a lot more damage than he is, but he's really just kind of rolling with the punches, dipping up underneath, and keeping that rear arm tucked in tight near his chin. So lead arm is securing something. It's a leverage guard. Lead arm is a leverage guard, or a jab just kind of probing, looking to get a hold of something, and the rear hand is just kind of covering up as he moves inside into close range with the head movement. What's really interesting is just how many things he could do off of this approach, how many different techniques, both with wrestling and with striking, and combining them together. If he wants to go for a takedown, then he's really close to just pinning himself to his opponent. He's already heading down. One of his arms is already outstretched, and he's probably drawing a counter so that it's easy to wrap his arm around a leg or a waist or whatever he wants to do with his lead arm. And his rear hand is in position to pretty much do whatever he wants with it. So takedown-wise, it's a great entry. And what he normally does, too, a majority of the time, is he'll also use it to dirty box. So what that lead hand could do, as long as it gets inside his opponent's rear hand, is come up and collar tie, which is how he got Miocic with that first big uppercut that he landed. He had that leverage guard, turned it into a collar tie, pulled him in to his rear uppercut because his arm's in a perfect position to do that. So there's a lot of stuff that you could do off of that entry. And what's interesting, too, is that DC doesn't just prioritize that entry. So that's a highly defensive one. You could even lean back as you kind of lean, outside your opponent's punch. You could lean back. You could ride the punches. Along with that, he also will face forward, think of a forward-facing fighter like Tyson, and use side-to-side head movement. But while he's doing that, very much unlike Tyson in his peekaboo, boxing stance, he'll be hand fighting. So he'll have both his hands out in front of him, squared up, so that he could hand fight his opponent's hands and do guard manipulations and strikes off of those. And we saw this happen several times throughout this fight as well. DC actually lost a couple exchanges off of hand fighting from that position, but we're going to get to that in a second when we talk about what Miocic did well. What DC does well from this position is he'll flare out an elbow. So he'll go from hand fighting, which means, he's taking his hands and he's bothering his opponent's hands, basically, just to try to get a superior position like they do in wrestling all the time. So he's hand fighting, and then Miocic throws something at him. DC will use that kind of windshield wiper head movement where you're standing straight forward, and just like a windshield wiper, your upper body just goes side to side and you duck your chin and maybe look away, in conjunction with an elbow block. So he'll keep his arms bent and just kind of flare one elbow up. I guess you'd call it a parry at that point. So he'll use that in conjunction with elbow parries. So, this is once again something to where it's using a old school boxing technique, almost like a peekaboo head movement system, but you're combining it with grappling elements. And he'll also, clinch off of this. He'll use that upward elbow block and then circle his hand underneath and then get into clinches to try to take people down or strike off of them. Like I said before, Miocic is kind of the exact opposite of this. He'll do some techniques that are blended together. I'm not saying he never does it, but usually he has just very clean boxing and very clean wrestling. And that's what ended up, I feel, costing him this fight. So when the fight began, it became apparent that DC could have some success with striking off of that entry that I talked about before, the sideways entry. But he was having a lot of difficulty wrestling off of it. Miocic is much, much bigger, and he's an amazing wrestler. And DC got taken to the cage almost immediately when he tried to enter off of that. Now, in so much as DC was having trouble using pure wrestling offensively, Miocic still really couldn't get into a majorly dominant position. So it was just kind of a stalemate, with Miocic being able to put on more pressure than DC was able to, but not really able to take him to the ground. Mostly, he'd just get him up against the cage. He'd get an underhook or a collar tie and wrist control with the other hand, try to leverage him down, try to get him to the ground. I think DC got on a knee once, but he was able to work his way right back up. So it became apparent that at least for the first round, unless someone, if it was going to go longer, maybe if someone got tired, it would change. But it became apparent early on that this fight was most likely going to be decided with the two guys on their feet. So then they got off the cage, and that's when DC started trying to hand fight, and actually lost the first exchange hand fighting. But then he started using a really nice flicker jab, actually, from a more square position, which you don't normally see. And he was doing it with both hands. It did result in an unintentional eye poke. It's not really something you could look at DC as doing intentionally, because if you think about it, that's usually done with boxing gloves on, and you don't need to worry about that shit. You just loosen your arm at the, upon retraction or even at the last second, because it's more meant just to bother and sting than it is to do any kind of actual damage. But in MMA, kind of a big problem. So I guess if you're doing that, a loose jab, just keep your fingers tight or you'll get called for an eye poke. But he started using that in conjunction with really nice leg kicks, and just the way he was landing them were just all timing, because he was from a farther, he's got less of a reach than Miocic, and he was still able to land some pretty deep leg kicks from pretty close. So that was impressive too. But that point brings me to another. I wouldn't want to, I don't know if it's a detriment or a benefit, because it helped Miocic out, and just as much as it hurt him, but it ended up, hurting him just as bad, is how close he gets, how tight his punches are. Because if you look at it, he's got the longer reach and he's the bigger man, and he's got incredible footwork. So you would think that he'd want to keep the fight at long range. And looking at this round, this one round fight, every time he stiff-armed DC, he was able to even knock him off balance one time doing it, he was able to land some strikes off of it. He was able to maintain distance if he wanted to. But rather than do that, he chose to fight DC up close. So that's something interesting to think about. So a couple lead exchanges, and then they got up against the cage with DC had his back against the cage again. And at this point, he escaped just really beautifully. He wrapped his leg around Miocic's leg and started to just kind of angle out a little bit, to the point where I thought he was going to go for a single leg. And then Miocic really didn't want that to happen, obviously, so he was forced to put his back against the cage. And then they just kind of worked their way back to the center of the ring. And at this point, Miocic started to hurt DC. And I thought, wow, okay, we could see a knockout here. And I feel like we were actually close to seeing Miocic knock down DC at this point in the fight. If you want to go back and watch it at some point, that when the second time they come off the cage, Miocic is doing an amazing job. His punches are still tight, right? So he still comes in close, but he leaves immediately. He doesn't want to get caught up in what DC can do, which, hindsight's 2020. Probably would have been a good idea for the rest of the fight. But he just came in with these. First, DC tried to hand fight, and then Miocic landed an elbow off of it, John Jones style. And then he backed away, came in with a couple tight hooks, and then a 1-2, and caught DC while he was squared up with some hard shots. And DC, to his credit, obviously he's been doing this a while. He knows when you're fighting an opponent with longer range, the thing to do if you're getting lit up probably isn't to back up. Maybe for a second to circle, different circumstances, blah, 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 blah. But if your style is DC's style, you're going to find safety on the inside. So to his credit, he kept coming at him. And I feel this is the first time where what I was talking about previously really came into effect here, because DC was first able to survive through blending his grappling and his striking together during these exchanges. He'd counter one of Miocic's punches, immediately turn it into some kind of hold, and then immediately turn that hold into some kind of strike, just back and forth, strike, hold, either with the same arm or with using one arm to kind of prepare and set up the other arm to strike. And the most impressive thing he did during all of these, after he kind of backed Miocic away and established great defense off of this, both through his ability to counter strike and his ability to clinch and intermix the two, was he started probing with his rear hand like he was hand fighting. He wanted to hand fight again, right? And so that invited Miocic to put his own hand up, because he didn't want DC getting a hold of him to be able to manipulate his guard or wrestle. So Miocic extends his hand to hand fight, but it was a feint. So DC used a wrestling feint, just like GSP. He used a wrestling feint in order to set up a lead hook that ended up connecting. So that was that section of the fight. And Miocic was impressive, but just it's hard to win against someone when they have these tools that you don't have. At this point, DC started once again landing those really, really hard close leg kicks in conjunction with those kind of flicker jabs, and even flicker crosses off his, rear hand too. And this is when the eye poke happened. And I don't know how much this affected the fight. I think it still would have gone the same way, but I think it definitely did have an impact. So whenever something like that happens, it's never good. DC got eye poked too, actually. If you go to Reddit, /r/MMA, I think that's still the top post up there, which is pretty, interesting. I guess it didn't affect him as much, but I think you should be allowed a long ass break if that happens to you. And I need to check the rules on that. I know you're allowed to take 5 minutes or maybe more, but I know 5 minutes for sure for groin kicks. Eye pokes should definitely be allowed the same thing, because they really alter fights so much. That being said, I said it before, it really wasn't intentional, and I don't think it affected the course of the fight too greatly, because in the end it was the techniques both fighters used that ended up kind of deciding it, and it was already being decided by that point anyways. But, I'm always down to see a rematch between those two, because I felt, like I said earlier, there were a couple moments where Miocic was definitely close to possibly taking down DC, knocking him out. And if he just added on 1 or 2 more punches, I felt he could have. But anyways, so DC got a warning and the fight went on. At this point in the fight, DC entered the matrix. Like, it was absolutely beautiful to watch. First, he landed a switch kick he feinted his jab, switched his feet, and then landed a beautiful kick to the midsection, like right across the abdomen, and a lot of impact behind it. And I'm like, holy shit! It didn't look like he'd be able to do that, but he did. And next, he crouched down low, right, to about like waist level, and did like a 90-degree pivot to evade 2 or 3 strikes, like very Floyd Mayweather-ish, who, being able to duck down that low and pivot to that great, that great of an extent requires just so much balance and athleticism, and to be moving your head the whole time while doing it was freaking crazy. So then DC starts hand fighting with them again, landing all these flicker jabs and leg kicks off of it. He's coming in, he's throwing hooks, he's framing off of Miocic and then stepping back just out of Miocic's jab and then stepping back in and flicking across. He's switching his hips as he throws his cross, turning it into a jab. And you're seeing this done by someone who, I know this has been said a million times before, but he looks like he's like a dad at your barbecue, You wouldn't think this guy'd be able to do this, but he looks like a freaking superhero at this point. So then they enter into the last exchange of the fight. DC comes in that same entrance I told you about at the very beginning, the Rocky Marciano type 1. Lead arm is extended, head is ducked low, right? And then the other arm's protecting it. So he gets a collar tie off of his jab, and Miocic has an underhook, and his other hand, his lead hand, is pinning DC's elbow to his body. DC's rear hand is being pinned. So he's looking to leverage DC. So he steps his foot inside just a little deeper and puts his hips close, right? DC knows exactly what's happening. So he takes his overhook, he takes his collar tie, whatever you want to call it, because he does it with just kind of a bent elbow. He shortens his arm, right? He brings his hand in close to his shoulder and then sneaks his arm around and underneath. So now he's got an underhook and his foot is outside of Miocic's, right? So, and while this has happened, because he's kind of leveraged his body out this way, Miocic loses control of DC's elbow. So now DC's right hand is free, and he's got a superior position, and he's got an underhook, and he's pissed off, right? So, worst case scenario. So Miocic tries to step away out of harm's reach, and I think he tries to reestablish wrist control. I'm not sure. I need to watch it again. But DC throws the tightest overhand I've ever seen anyone throw in my life. Like I said, I need to watch it again, but I'm not sure if it was so tight. I'm not sure if the fist hit, the elbow hit, or both of them hit one after the other, which would be pretty fucking badass, But he tight overhand, and it just perfect right on the chin, and Miocic went down and he was just done. And as far as I'm concerned, this is 100% win for DC. There's no controversy here. The eye poke is going to be used by detractors for a long time, and in a way that's good, because that shit really needs to stop. I don't know if it will take stricter penalties. I mean, that would be nice. I mean, yeah, it's done on accident, but come on. I don't know if the gloves need to be redesigned or what the hell needs to happen with that. But I don't think it should in any way detract from DC's victory in this, because I don't think it was a big enough factor. I think this would have ended up happening anyways. Because in the end of the fight, Miocic was just thinking about grappling, and he wasn't thinking about striking at the same time. And DC was thinking about both at the same time. And fights happen in split instances, hundredths of a second. And because of the way DC does things, he was able to take advantage of that. So I feel really bad for Miocic. He's one of my favorite fighters. He's really fun to watch. DC, I have to say, a little bit more of a favorite fighter for me. But I love both these guys, and I hope we get to see a rematch. And I can't wait to see them both fight. I'm actually more interested in a rematch of this fight than I am of seeing DC versus Brock Lesnar. But, I'll watch that too, obviously. So that's the podcast for today. I'm going to be putting out, like I said before, Sugar Ray Leonard versus Duran #1 next. So stay tuned for that. And I've got an MMA video coming up for the first time in a long time. So stay tuned for that too. Check out all my various shit I'm selling below. People are telling me that it's awesome shit, so that's cool. I've gotten some emails and some comments here or there, and people are loving it, which I'm really happy about. I'm gonna send out a revised version of the book too, around the same time that I release the paperback, just to clean it up a little bit, add some stuff in here or there, and you know, if you've read it and there's something you wanted to see in that book and you didn't see it, or you were confused about a certain section or any of that, just email me or leave it in the comment below, and I'll note that and put it in the revision. So that's it for this podcast. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching, and happy training.